The sky didn't tear open with a majestic roar, and there was no grand orchestral swelling to announce the end of our isolation. The alien dreadnought just dropped into South Philly with the wet metallic crunch of a dumpster falling off a garbage truck. They came to conquer clad in armor that refracted the neon glow of a Wawa sign, but they severely underestimated the locals. By sunrise, they weren't our overlords, they were pedestrians. The night the sky fell, Tommy was under a 2004 Hyundai Elantra, trying to pry a rusted exhaust manifold loose without stripping the bolts. The garage smelled like it always did at 2:00 a.m. in late November, a stale cocktail of spilled motor oil, old coffee, and the sharp metallic tang of WD-40. His hands were numb. The knuckles on his right hand were bleeding a slow, tacky ooze, mixing with the grease permanently tattooed into his skin. He didn't look up when the first tremor hit. He just assumed it was a freight train rattling down the nearby tracks, or maybe a sinkhole finally swallowing the pothole-cratered intersection of 4th and Snyder. But then the concrete floor heaved. Not a shake, but a violent rolling shudder that knocked the droplight from its hook. It shattered against the concrete, plunging him into the dim, jaundiced glow of the street lamp, filtering through the frosted windows. A sound followed a low, oscillating bass note that didn't just hurt the ears, but rattled the teeth in Tommy's jaw and made the half-digested soft pretzel in his stomach do a slow turn. "Son of a bitch," Tommy muttered, sliding the creeper out from under the Hyundai. He wiped his hands on a rag that was already more dirt than cotton. He was tired. His lower back screamed at him. He didn't have the emotional bandwidth for an earthquake. He yanked the rolling steel door up. The metal groaned in protest, freezing halfway. Tommy ducked under it, stepping out into the biting November air. He expected to see a collapsed building, or maybe a multi-car pileup. What he saw instead made his exhausted brain stall, taking up the entire lot across the street, a lot that previously held 3 abandoned row homes, and a rusted-out chain-link fence was a ship. There was no other word for it, though it didn't look like anything from the movies. It wasn't a sleek saucer or a flying cigar. It was an angular, brutalist monstrosity, the size of an office building, slammed into the asphalt at a severe tilt. The hull was made of a dark, iridescent metal that seemed to drink the ambient streetlights. It hummed, shedding a veil of thick, ozone-scented steam that smelled like a short-circuiting electrical panel mixed with burnt sugar. Tommy stood on the curb, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He wasn't terrified. Not exactly. Fear required a certain level of comprehension. Right now, he was just profoundly offended. The ship had crushed Sal's corner bodega, completely flattened it. More importantly to Tommy, the shockwave had kicked up a slab of concrete that was now resting comfortably on the hood of a 1998 Honda Civic he had just spent 3 days repainting. A screen door slammed to his left. Patty, who ran the unlicensed hair salon out of her basement, 2 doors down, shuffled out onto her stoop in a pink terry cloth bathrobe and curlers. She was holding a half-empty mug of something that wasn't coffee. "Tommy," she called out, her voice raspy from 40 years of menthol cigarettes. "The hell is that? The city put in a new substation." "I think it's a spaceship, Patty," Tommy said, his voice flat. "In South Philly, nobody wants to land here." She squinted through the steam. "Did they hit Sal's? Looks like it." "Shame. He owed me $20. Doors were opening down the block. The neighborhood was waking up. Men in sweatpants and faded Eagles hoodies, women clutching heavy coats around their shoulders. They didn't run screaming. This was Philadelphia. Panic was a luxury reserved for suburbs. Here, a disruption of this magnitude was first and foremost an inconvenience. Tommy shoved his hands into his pockets to keep them from shaking. The reality of the situation was starting to bleed through the fatigue. Aliens. Actual honest-to-God aliens had just parked in his zip code. His heart did a frantic double time against his ribs. He felt the sudden urge to run back inside, lock the flimsy steel door and hide under the Hyundai. But then a seam appeared on the side of the towering hull. It glowed with a sickening, pulsing violet light. The metal didn't slide open. It seemed to dissolve, folding in on itself like liquid origami. A heavy synthetic ramp extended, slamming down onto the cracked asphalt with a sound like a thunderclap. The crowd that had gathered, maybe 30 people now standing on the perimeter of the smoking crater, fell silent. The only sound was the hiss of the ship's cooling systems and the distant wail of police sirens that were entirely too far away to do anyone any good. Heavy footsteps echoed from within the violet glow. Rhythmic, militaristic. "Here we go," a voice muttered from the crowd. It was Kev, a massive guy who drove a tow truck and had a neck thicker than Tommy's thighs. Kev was holding a heavy steel tire iron, just resting it casually against his shoulder. Figures emerged from the mist. They were tall, maybe 7 feet, clad in armor that looked like interlocking plates of polished obsidian. Their helmets were elongated, featureless, save for a single horizontal slit that glowed with the same violet light as their ship. There were 5 of them. They moved with a predatory grace, descending the ramp to stand before the gathered humans. The one in the center, clearly the commander, raised a hand. A gauntlet, covered in what looked like circuitry, hummed to life. When it spoke, the voice didn't come from the alien. It came from a small, floating orb that had detached from the commander's shoulder. The translation was perfect, booming with artificial authority, echoing off the brick facades of the row homes. "Citizens of this primitive rock," the orb announced, its volume painfully loud. "You have been conquered by the Valen Empire. Submit and your existence will be tolerated as a resource. Resist and your cities will be reduced to ash. Kneel before Sub-Commander Tarek." Silence hung in the cold air. Tommy looked at the alien. Then he looked at the ship. Under the glare of the streetlights, Tommy's mechanic eyes automatically did what they were trained to do. He wasn't looking at a vessel of unimaginable terror. He was looking at parts, the ramp the aliens had walked down. It was thick, supported by massive hydraulic-looking struts. The metal didn't have a speck of rust. It gleamed, and the exposed wiring near the joint where the ramp met the hull, it looked like solid, hyperconductive copper, thicker than a man's arm. Tommy swallowed hard. He was terrified. His knees felt like water. But he was also 3 months behind on his mortgage, and the bank was threatening to take the shop. He glanced over at Kev. Kev wasn't looking at the aliens either. Kev was staring at the anti-gravity thruster pods, ringing the base of the ship, which were currently idling, glowing with a soft blue luminescence. "Hey, Tommy," Kev whispered loudly, not breaking his gaze from the thrusters. "What kind of metal you think that hull is made of? Think a reciprocating saw could get through it?" Tommy wiped his greasy mouth with the back of his hand. "Give me a carbide-tipped blade, Kev. I'll get through the gates of hell." The alien stood in perfect, statuesque stillness, waiting for the screaming. They waited for the humans to drop to their knees and beg for mercy. They had done this on a dozen worlds. The protocol was always the same: shock and awe, followed by subservience. But nobody was kneeling. Instead, a murmur was rippling through the crowd. It wasn't a murmur of terror. It was a murmur of appraisal. Sub-Commander Tarek, standing tall in his obsidian armor, shifted his weight. The servos in his suit let out a faint, high-pitched whir. "Did he say his name was Derek?" Patty asked loudly, taking a sip from her mug. "Tarek, I think," a guy named Brendan said. Brendan ran a scrap yard out by the airport. He was currently rubbing his chin, his eyes darting frantically across the ship's exposed underbelly. "Hey, Derek, "You got a permit to park that thing here?" The translator orb buzzed clearly, struggling to contextualize the concept of a parking permit. Insolent fauna. The orb boomed again, the voice sounding slightly more irritated. "This vessel claims this territory in the name of the High Valen. The structure you call bodega has been neutralized to establish a perimeter." "He killed Sal," someone in the back yelled. "Sal was in Jersey visiting his mother," Patty corrected. "But they killed his cat, and all the tasty cakes." Tommy stepped forward, ignoring the screaming of his own self-preservation instincts. He approached the edge of the crater, stopping about 10 feet from the aliens. The ambient heat coming off the ship's hull was intense, drying the sweat on his forehead. Up close, the ship was a treasure trove. He saw panels held together by what looked like hexagonal bolts. He saw exhaust ports lined with a material that didn't just reflect light, but seemed to bend it. The sheer value of raw, unknown metallurgical alloys sitting in front of him was staggering. "Hey," Tommy said, raising his voice over the hum of the ship. "You are Tarek." The alien commander turned its featureless visor toward Tommy. The violet slit pulsed. "Speak your final plea, native." "Yeah, listen," Tommy said, pointing a grease-stained finger at the ramp. "You're blocking the street, and you dropped a ton of concrete on my customer's Civic. I'm liable for that." The alien stared at him. The orb floated lower. "You speak of a vehicle, a crude combustion-based transport. Your concerns are microscopic. You are now property of the Empire. Look at the plating," Brendan whispered, having sidled up next to Tommy. He smelled like cheap beer and motor oil. "It's not riveted. It's magnetically sealed. But look at the base of the thrusters. See those heavy clamps?" Tommy squinted. At the base of the blue glowing anti-gravity pods, there were thick physical clamps locking the thrusters to the hull. They looked suspiciously like locking nuts. Big ones, maybe 2 inches across. "I see 'em," Tommy whispered back. "If we drop the pressure in those lines..." Brendan muttered, his eyes wide with a feverish, opportunistic gleam. "I bet those pods just pop right off. They got away, 200 pounds apiece, if that's palladium or something similar that's 50 grand a pop." "More," Tommy said, his heart hammering. His fear was actively warring with the most Philadelphian of instincts, the hustle. The ship was an invader, yes, but it was also unattended scrap. Subcommander Tarek raised his arm. A weapon built into his forearm, deployed with a sharp clack, a barrel glowing with lethal white-hot energy. "Silence," the orb commanded. "To demonstrate the futility of your existence, we shall vaporize the surrounding dwellings." Tarek pointed his arm at Patty's house. "Whoa, whoa, whoa, hold up!" Kev shouted, stepping past Tommy. Kev wasn't a tall man, but he was wide, wearing a high-vis yellow jacket that strained at the zipper. "You ain't vaporizing nothing. My grandmother's ashes are in there." Tarek did not lower the weapon. "Ash will join ash." Before the alien could fire, a sharp, metallic screech tore through the night. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't an alien sound. It was the beautiful, chaotic, ear-splitting scream of a DeWalt 20-volt max cordless angle grinder. Everyone, including the aliens, snapped their heads toward the rear of the ship. Sitting near the back, where the massive exhaust baffles flared out, was a teenager named Leo. Leo was notoriously known for stealing catalytic converters in under 45 seconds. He was currently perched on a stabilizer fin, a shower of bright orange sparks raining down on him as he aggressively ground the blade into a highly sensitive exposed plasma conduit coupling. "Leo, what the hell are you doing?" Tommy yelled, though he couldn't hide the awe in his voice. Leo didn't stop grinding. "Look at this pipe. Tommy, it cuts like butter, but it's heavy as lead. I can fence this by morning." The aliens were paralyzed. Their rigid militaristic training had prepared them for laser fire, kinetic bombardment, and desperate suicide charges. It had not prepared them for a teenager in a puffy North Face jacket, stealing their ship's parts while it was still idling. "Halt!" the orb shrieked. "That is a Class 4 plasma manifold. If you sever that line, the cooling matrix will clang." Leo kicked the severed coupling. A 3-foot section of glowing iridescent metal broke free and clattered to the asphalt. Leo scrambled down, scooped it up with heavy welding gloves, and sprinted down the alleyway into the dark. The ship immediately let out a pained, warbling, mechanical groan. The blue glow of the rear thrusters flickered, sputtered, and died. A thick cloud of grey smoke began venting from the severed line. Sub-Commander Tarek lowered his weapon, his visor darting between the alley where Leo vanished and the hissing, broken exhaust of his billion-credit warship. For a moment, the supreme arrogance of the galactic conqueror cracked. He took the manifold." The orb translated its voice, dropping in pitch, sounding genuinely bewildered. "He took it." Kev looked at Tommy. Tommy looked at Kev. The fear evaporated, replaced entirely by the electric thrill of a city that had just realized the Emperor had no clothes, and more importantly, the Emperor's chariot was made of highly fensible materials. "Hey, Kev," Tommy said, reaching into his back pocket and pulling out a heavy adjustable wrench. "Go get the hydraulic jacks from the shop. Brendan, call your cousins. Tell them to bring the plasma cutter and every sawzall they own." Brendan grinned a wolfish, terrifying expression. He whipped out his phone. The invasion was over. The dismantling had begun. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a swarm. Sub-Commander Tarek, finally snapping out of his shock, raised his weapon again. "Lethal force authorized," he bellowed through the orb. "Exterminate the scavengers." He fired. A beam of white light punched through the air, completely missing Kev and vaporizing a fire hydrant on the corner. A geyser of freezing water erupted 30 feet into the air, raining down on the street and rapidly freezing on the pavement. The aliens didn't have time to recalibrate. Before Tarek could fire a second shot, Patty had retreated to her stoop and hurled her ceramic mug. It wasn't a tactical strike, but 40 years of throwing things at her ex-husband had given her a wicked arm. The heavy mug struck the floating translator orb dead center. It sparked, let out a sad mechanical chirp, and crashed to the ground, shattering into pieces. Tarek spun around, barking orders in a harsh, clicking alien tongue. The 4 soldiers behind him raised their weapons, but they were suddenly slipping on the rapidly icing pavement. "Get under their guard!" someone shouted. It was Old Man O'Malley, a retired Union pipe fitter, who was swinging a heavy chain with a padlock on the end. Tommy didn't charge the aliens. He didn't want to be a hero. He wanted the ship. He scrambled down the crater and dove under the ship's massive hull, right beneath one of the front thruster pods. It was hot down here, the metal radiating a dry, oppressive heat that made his eyes water. But the clamps were right there. Massive, intricate locking mechanisms holding the anti-gravity engines in place. Tommy clicked on his headlamp. The bolts weren't hexagonal. They were star-shaped with a weird pin in the center. "Security talks." Tommy muttered, a vicious grin spreading across his face. "You stupid bastards. You traveled across the galaxy and you used security talks." He reached into his tool belt. He didn't have a bit that big, but he had a heavy-duty cold chisel and a 3-pound sledgehammer. Above him, the chaos was beautiful. Tarek and his soldiers were heavily armored, their suits practically impervious to small arms fire. But they couldn't shoot what was directly underneath them, and they were drastically outnumbered by people who didn't fight with honor, but with industrial tools. Kev had returned. He hadn't brought the hydraulic jacks. He had brought his tow truck. The massive diesel engine roared as Kev backed the FI-50 down the street, hopping the curb and sliding on the ice. The reverse beepers echoed through the night. Beep, 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 a surreal counterpoint to the alien shouting. Kev slammed it into park, jumped out, and unspooled the heavy winch cable. "Brendan, hook it!" he roared. Brendan and 3 of his cousins darted through the freezing rain of the busted hydrant. One of the alien soldiers fired missing Brendan, but turning a nearby mailbox into a puddle of slag. Brendan ignored it. He threw the heavy steel J-hook over one of the ship's massive hydraulic landing struts, locking the safety latch. "Hit it!" Brendan screamed, diving behind the crater lip. Kev threw the winch lever. The truck's engine revved high. The heavy steel cable snapped taut, vibrating with immense tension. The alien ship was heavy, but it was currently off balance due to its crash landing, and the fact that Leo had already disabled the rear stabilizers. The winch strained the truck's rear tires, lifting an inch off the ground. Then the landing strut groaned. Screech! The metal bent. The alien soldiers stumbled as the entire front half of the dreadnought shifted violently to the left, dropping 3 feet with a bone-jarring crash. "My leg!" One of the alien soldiers shrieked, or at least the clicking sound it made sounded distinctly panicked. It had been standing too close to the strut, and the sudden shift had pinned its heavily armored leg beneath the hull. Underneath the ship, Tommy felt the massive structure drop. He had rolled out of the way just in time, but the sudden shift had exposed the thruster clamp perfectly. He lined up the cold chisel against the lip of the giant starbolt. He swung the 3-pound sledge. Clang! The bolt shifted a millimeter. Tommy swung again. He was sweating, despite the cold grease mixing with the blood on his knuckles. He wasn't thinking about the Galactic Empire. He was thinking about the mortgage. He was thinking about the property taxes. He swung again. Clang! The bolt spun loose. A hiss of pressurized gas erupted from the clamp. Tommy hit the release latch. With a heavy solid thud, the 200-pound anti-gravity pod detached from the hull and fell onto the pavement. The blue light within it flickered and died. "I got one!" Tommy yelled, grabbing the pod by a heavy recess and dragging it out from under the ship. It was incredibly heavy, but the adrenaline rushing through his veins made it feel like a hollow plastic toy. He dragged it up the crater edge, just as 3 pickup trucks screeched to a halt at the intersection. 6 guys piled out, carrying acetylene torches, crowbars, and a generator. "Where do you want us, Tommy?" shouted one of them, a guy who ran a local body shop. "The side panels." Tommy pointed to the sleek, iridescent hull armor. "Peel it back, don't damage the wiring underneath it. Looks like high-grade copper." Subcommander Tarek watched in mounting, paralyzing horror. His translation orb was broken, so he couldn't understand the shouting, but the intent was universally clear. His glorious warship, the pride of the Valen fleet, was being stripped to the bone. A shower of sparks erupted near the ship's primary airlock as 2 men in welding masks began cutting through the magnetic seals with a plasma cutter. "Back to the ship," Tarek commanded his men in their native tongue, realizing that conquest was impossible. Survival was currently their only objective. They tried to retreat up the ramp, but the ramp was no longer there. While Tarek had been focused on Kev's tow truck, a crew of scrappers had descended upon the ramp's hydraulic hinges with battery-powered sawzalls. The blades had chewed right through the alien alloy. The massive ramp was currently being loaded into the back of a rusted Ford F-250 by 5 men, chanting, "Heave, heave!" Tarek stood at the edge of the crater, completely cut off from his ship. His armor was streaked with dirt and freezing water. The weapon on his arm sparked out of energy. He looked at Tommy, who was sitting on the anti-gravity pod, wiping the grease from his forehead, breathing heavily. Tommy looked back at the imposing 7-foot alien commander. The terror was gone. Tommy just felt a profound sense of satisfaction. "Should have paid for parking," Tommy said, patting the thruster pod. The sounds of cutting wheels and tearing metal echoed into the Philadelphia night, a symphony of industrious vandalism. The invasion had failed before it even began, undone by a neighborhood that knew the street value of everything. By 3:15 a.m., a cold, gritty drizzle started to fall, mixing with the dust of Sal's pulverized bodega to coat everything in a layer of pale, concrete-scented mud. The Valen dreadnought, once a terrifying monolith of interstellar supremacy, now looked like a stripped carcass on a bad block. Subcommander Tarek stood in the icy slush, his armored shoulders slumped. His 4 surviving soldiers were huddled together behind him, shivering. The internal climate controls of their obsidian suits had failed 20 minutes ago, when Brendan's cousins cut the primary power lines to the ship's port side. Tommy stood a few yards away, a lit cigarette dangling from his lip. He didn't even smoke anymore, or hadn't in 5 years, but Old Man O'Malley had offered him a stale Camel, and given the circumstances, Tommy felt he'd earned the lung damage. His hands were tucked deep into his armpits for warmth. The adrenaline crash was hitting him hard, leaving a sour, metallic taste in the back of his throat, and a deep, throbbing ache at the base of his skull. Flashing red and blue lights finally cut through the steam and drizzle. 2 Philadelphia police cruisers rolled up to the perimeter, their tires crunching over shattered glass and pieces of alien alloy. The doors opened, and 2 officers stepped out. They didn't draw their weapons. They didn't dive behind their doors for cover. They stood up, pulled their heavy winter coats tight against the wind, and stared at the massive sparking hull taking up the entire lot. Officer Dougherty, a man who looked like he had been born with a grey mustache and a profound sense of exhaustion, slammed his door shut. He walked over to Tommy, his boots splashing in the slush. "Tommy," Dougherty said, his voice flat. "Hey, Bob." Dougherty looked past Tommy to the 7-foot alien warlord standing by the crater. Then he looked at the gutted remains of the ship. Finally, he looked at Kev, who was currently using a crowbar to pry a glowing control panel off one of the severed landing struts. "Dispatch said there was a noise complaint," Dougherty said, pulling a damp notepad from his breast pocket. "And illegal dumping." "Yeah," Tommy said, pointing the glowing cherry of his cigarette at Tarek. "They dropped that thing right on Sal's. Crushed a '98 Civic I was working on, too. Paint was barely dry." Dougherty sighed. The sound carried the weight of a man who was 2 years from a pension and fiercely resented being awake. He walked past Tommy, approaching Tarek. The alien commander stiffened. The servos in his frozen suit whined in protest. Without the translation orb, Tarek couldn't communicate, but the universal language of law enforcement transcended galaxies. Dougherty stopped 3 feet from the alien, clicking his pen. "You the owner of this vehicle?" Tarek stared down at the human, his violet visor flickering weakly. He let out a series of harsh, clicking syllables. "I don't care where you're from, pal," Dougherty interrupted, writing on his pad. "You can't park whatever this is in a residential zone. You don't have hazard lights on, you completely destroyed private property, and you're leaking an unidentified fluid into the city sewer grate." Dougherty gestured with his pen toward a viscous, glowing green sludge oozing from a severed pipe on the ship's belly. It smelled intensely of spearmint and bleach. Tarek slammed a heavy armored fist against his own chest plate, a gesture of military defiance. He pointed a long metallic finger at Dougherty, letting out a roar that sounded like a garbage disposal, chewing on a handful of silverware. Dougherty didn't flinch. He ripped a yellow slip of paper from his pad and slapped it directly onto Tarek's wet obsidian chest plate. It stuck there, a bright beacon of municipal bureaucracy. "That's a citation for the property damage and an order to vacate," Dougherty said, completely deadpan. "You got 48 hours to move this junk or the city impounds it. Court date is on the back. Don't be late. The judge on Tuesdays is a prick." Tarek looked down at the yellow ticket. He peeled it off his chest, holding it in two massive fingers, staring at it as if it were a highly volatile explosive. "Hey, Bob!" Kev yelled, tossing the crowbar into the bed of his truck. "If they don't move it, I get the towing contract right. I'm gonna need a bigger flatbed. Maybe a barge." Dougherty just shook his head, walking back to his cruiser. "Not my circus, Kev. Just keep the noise down. People gotta work in the morning." Tommy watched the cruiser pull away. He looked back at Tarek, who was still staring at the parking ticket. The sheer absurdity of the situation finally cracked Tommy's fatigue, pulling a short, ragged laugh from his chest. But the laugh died quickly when a loud, wet thud echoed from the open maw of the ship. Brendan popped his head out from the jagged hole where the ramp used to be. His face was covered in a mix of grease and some kind of iridescent blue powder. "Hey, Tommy!" Brendan shouted, his voice echoing from the cavernous interior. "You gotta come in here. I think we found the engine room, but it's weird. It feels squishy." Tommy groaned, his lower back flaring with pain as he shifted his weight. "Squishy. Yeah, man. Bring a flashlight. And maybe a mop." Tommy tossed the cigarette stub into the slush. The smart thing to do was to lock his doors, go to sleep, and let Brendan get eaten by whatever alien horror was lurking inside. But the anti-gravity pod sitting in his garage was currently worth more than his life insurance policy. If there was an engine in there, he had to see it. "Stay here," Tommy told Old Man O'Malley. "Keep an eye on the big guy. Make sure he doesn't try anything stupid." O'Malley hefted his heavy steel chain, giving Tarek a toothless grin. "Oh, we're gonna get along just fine. Ain't we, Derek?" Tommy grabbed a heavy-duty mag light from his tool belt and began the precarious climb over the rubble, stepping into the belly of the beast. The inside of the Valen ship did not look like a starship. It didn't have sleek white corridors or blinking computer terminals or automatic doors that slid open with a pleasant hiss. Stepping into the hull was like stepping into the internal organs of a massive cybernetic whale. Tommy clicked on his mag light, sweeping the heavy yellow beam through the gloom. The air was thick, humid, and heavy. It smelled intensely of static electricity, spoiled milk, and hot pennies. The walls weren't made of flat metal panels. They were ribbed, curving inward, constructed from a dark, porous material that absorbed the light. "Brendan." Tommy called out, his voice swallowed instantly by the damp acoustics of the corridor. "Down here," came the muffled reply. Tommy walked carefully. The floor was canted at a severe 30-degree angle because of the collapsed landing strut. Under his heavy work boots, the decking had a strange, unsettling give to it. It wasn't metal. It felt like walking on a bruised apple wrapped in Kevlar. He followed the winding, organic-looking corridor. Everywhere he looked, the locals had already left their mark. Panels were pried off the walls, exposing thick, pulsing cables that looked uncomfortably like veins. A pile of alien emergency rations, grey cube-shaped blocks that smelled like drywall had been scattered on the floor, clearly rejected by whoever found them. Tommy ducked under a low-hanging archway that was dripping a translucent viscous fluid. A drop caught the back of his neck. It was freezing cold and made his skin go completely numb for 3 seconds before burning like a wasp's sting. He cursed, wiping it off frantically with his dirty rag. He found Brendan and Leo in a cavernous circular room deep in the ship's aft section. The walls here were pulsing with a slow, sickly amber light. In the center of the room, suspended in a web of thick, glowing cables, was a sphere the size of a cement mixer. It was a deep, mesmerizing violet, churning with an internal liquid light. "Look at this thing," Leo whispered, his eyes wide. He reached out a gloved hand toward one of the cables holding the sphere. "Don't touch it, you idiot!" Tommy snapped, swatting Leo's hand away. "You want to get vaporized? We don't know what the voltage is on those lines." Tommy stepped closer to the sphere. As he approached, the hair on his arms stood on end. A low, subsonic vibration radiated from the object so deep that Tommy didn't hear it so much as feel it rattling his dental fillings. It made him feel slightly nauseous, a distinct wave of vertigo washing over him. "It's the power core," Brendan said, shining his own cheap plastic flashlight at the base of the sphere. "Has to be. All the thickest wires run straight into it. And look," Brendan pointed to the base where the sphere rested in a heavy metallic cradle. There were latches, massive mechanical latches. They built it to be removable. Tommy muttered, his mechanic's brain overriding his nausea. He leaned in, studying the cradle. "It's a modular unit, same as a car battery, just scaled up." "So we take it," Leo said eagerly, pulling a pair of heavy wire cutters from his jacket pocket. Tommy grabbed him by the collar and yanked him back. "With what Leo wire cutters? You clip that line, and best case scenario, you get electrocuted. Worst case scenario, you turn South Philly into a crater the size of the moon." "So how do we get it?" Brendan asked, wiping a smear of the amber fluid off his cheek. "Frankie's coming down at dawn. If we have the engine of a UFO, Frankie will give us enough cash to buy the whole damn block." Tommy stared at the latches. They were thick, heavy metal, locked tightly into the sphere's housing. But there was a manual release lever on the side, a heavy bar covered in alien text. He didn't trust it. It was too easy. "We need to discharge the lines first," Tommy said, backing away from the sphere. He looked around the room. There were secondary conduits running along the walls, feeding into smaller auxiliary panels. "Leo, go back out. Tell Kev to bring the heavy jumper cables from the tow truck, the industrial ones, and a grounding spike. We're going to bleed the residual charge into the city grid before we pop those latches." Leo sprinted off his footsteps, squishing on the organic floor. Tommy looked back at the glowing core. The violet light reflected in his tired, bloodshot eyes. He was exhausted, he was terrified, and his back was killing him. But the low hum of the alien engine felt like a promise. It felt like rent money. It felt like breathing room. "We're actually doing this," Brendan whispered, a slightly hysterical edge to his voice. "We're stealing a spaceship's engine." "We aren't stealing it," Tommy said, pulling a heavy wrench from his belt and stepping up to the auxiliary panel. "We're salvaging abandoned property. Big difference." By 6:00 a.m., the sky over Philadelphia lightened to a bruised, miserable grey. The drizzle had stopped leaving the neighborhood, encased in a thin, dirty crust of ice. The ship was dead. The violet lights had gone out. The faint internal humming had stopped entirely. Without power, the dark, iridescent metal of the hull had dulled, looking less like advanced technology and more like a massive pile of cheap plastic molding. The locals had worked fast, driven by the knowledge that the authorities, the real authorities' men in black suits and unmarked vans, not Officer Dougherty, were inevitably coming. The street looked like a bizarre flea market. Piles of alien plating, bundles of hyperconductive wiring, and strange glowing technological components were stacked on folding tables and pickup truck tailgates. Tarek and his men had been corralled into a small chain-link enclosure behind Patty's house, normally reserved for her aggressive Rottweiler. They sat on overturned milk crates, completely stripped of their armor. Without their obsidian suits, the Valen looked surprisingly frail. They were tall, yes, but their limbs were spindly, their skin a pale, mottled grey. They had large, solid black eyes that watered constantly in the biting earth wind. Tarek sat shivering in a borrowed, oversized Philadelphia Flyers hoodie, clutching a paper cup of lukewarm Dunkin' Donuts coffee that Patty had forced into his hands. He took a sip, his face contorted in abject disgust, but the warmth seemed to stop his hands from shaking. He stared out through the chain-link fence, watching his glorious dreadnought being reduced to scrap metal, his empire's dignity dying in a South Philly alley. At the end of the block, A black Lincoln Town car rolled to a stop. "He's here!" Old Man O'Malley called out, leaning against a rusted fire escape. Frank stepped out of the car. Frank ran, Frank's surplus and electronics, over on Passyunk Avenue. Nobody knew exactly where Frank got his surplus, but if you needed a military-grade radio, a crate of MREs, or a stolen catalytic converter, fenced with 0 questions, asked Frank was the guy. He was a short, rotund man, wearing a long cashmere coat and a fedora that was 5 years out of style. He walked slowly down the street, his polished shoes crunching on the ice. He didn't look at the aliens in the dog run. He didn't look at the giant, gutted ship. He just looked at the tables of loot. Tommy stood by his garage. Inside, resting on a heavy wooden pallet, was the violet power core. It was dark now, having shut down perfectly when they pulled the manual release. Next to it sat the heavy anti-gravity pod. Frank stopped at Brendan's table. Brendan was holding a sleek, rifle-like weapon that he had pried out of the ship's armory. "What is this?" Frank asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Plasma rifle," Brendan said proudly. "Or something like it. It melts concrete, Frank. I saw it." Frank pulled a small jeweler's loop from his pocket, squeezed it into his eye and examined the weapon. He checked the barrel, tapped the casing with a manicured fingernail, and popped open a small hatch near the stock. "Battery is dead," Frank said, tossing the alien weapon back onto the table. It clattered against a pile of copper wiring. "Proprietary charging port. I can't sell a gun if the guy buying it can't plug it into a wall. It's useless. Give you $50 for the metal." $50, Brendan squawked. "Frank, it's an alien laser gun." "It's a paperweight." "Brendan," Frank countered without missing a beat. "You want to sell it to a museum, go to New York. You want cash today before the alphabet boys lock down this zip code, you take the 50. Brendan scowled, but he pocketed the crumpled $50 bill Frank handed him. Frank moved down the line, evaluating the extraterrestrial tech with the ruthless boredom of a man buying used lawn mowers. He gave Leo $100 for a pile of navigational touchscreens, citing poor screen resolution. He bought a bundle of hyperconductive wires off Old Man O'Malley for $200, noting that the insulation was sticky. Finally, Frank arrived at Tommy's garage. Tommy hit the button, and the rolling steel door chugged upward. He stepped aside, revealing the massive dark sphere of the power core and the heavy thruster pod. Frank stopped. He took the jeweler's loop out of his eye and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at the engine that had carried a crew across the vacuum of space, currently resting on a pallet, stained with old motor oil. "I pulled it clean," Tommy said, his voice rough from the cold and the dust. "Discharged the lines safely. No acid leaks, no radiation spikes. It's intact." Frank walked over to the sphere. He took off his expensive leather glove and placed a bare hand against the dark violet casing. He closed his eyes. "It's still warm," Frank murmured. "Yeah, it retains a charge." Tommy wiped his greasy hands on his jeans. "What's the number, Frank?" Frank turned around. He looked at Tommy, then out at the street, then toward the distant sound of approaching sirens. Not police sirens. Heavy, multi-toned sirens. The feds were finally waking up. "I have a guy in North Jersey," Frank said slowly, his eyes calculating. "Private aerospace contractor. He doesn't ask questions, and he pays in bearer bonds. I can move the thruster pod today. The core is going to require a specialized truck." "How much, Frank?" Tommy repeated, his chest tightening. Frank reached into his cashmere coat. He pulled out a thick, heavy envelope and tossed it onto Tommy's workbench. It landed with a soft, dense thud next to a rusted socket wrench. "There's 20,000 in there. Earnest money," Frank said. "When my guy in Jersey cuts the check for the core, you get another 150. but I take the thruster pod right now." Tommy stared at the envelope. He thought about the bank notices sitting on his kitchen counter. He thought about the 3 months of missed mortgage payments. He reached out and grabbed the envelope. It was heavy. It felt like salvation. "Kev," Tommy yelled out into the street. "Bring the forklift." Frank smiled, a thin, predatory curve of his lips. "Pleasure doing business with you, Tommy." Outside, Tarek watched Kev's forklift trundle into Tommy's garage. He watched the humans casually load the pinnacle of Valen engineering into the back of a rented U-Haul truck. He took another sip of the terrible lukewarm coffee. The invasion was officially over. Now they just had to figure out how to survive the neighborhood. The black SUVs didn't arrive with sirens. They rolled down 4th Street in a tight, silent convoy, their heavy, run-flat tires crushing the scattered remnants of alien circuitry into the slush. Behind them came 2 armored personnel carriers, matte black and featureless, blocking off the intersections. Tommy was in his garage, frantically stuffing the heavy manila envelope behind a loose cinder block in the wall directly behind his air compressor. His hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from the cold. It was the frantic, thrumming anxiety of a man who just committed a federal crime. Salvaging was one thing. Selling extraterrestrial hardware to a black market fence 3 minutes before the government arrived was treason or terrorism. Tommy wasn't entirely sure, but he knew it meant federal prison. He slid the cinder block back into place, smudging grease over the edges to hide the seams. He wiped his hands on his jeans, grabbed a rag and walked out into the biting morning air, just as the tactical teams poured out of the vehicles. They wore dark combat fatigues and carried rifles tight to their chests. They moved with precise, rigid efficiency, fanning out across the street to form a perimeter around the smoking, gutted carcass of the Valen dreadnought. A man in a charcoal overcoat stepped out of the lead SUV. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like an accountant who had been denied sleep for a week. He pinched the bridge of his nose, staring at the alien ship, then down at his tablet, then back at the ship. He walked toward Officer Dougherty, who was leaning against his cruiser, drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup. "Special Agent Miller," the man in the overcoat said, flashing a badge that Tommy couldn't read from 15 feet away. "What is the tactical situation here? Where are the hostiles?" Dougherty took a slow sip of his coffee. "Tactical situation is mostly weather-related, Agent Miller. Roads are slick. As for the hostiles..." He pointed a thumb over his shoulder toward Patty's yard. "They're in the dog run." Miller frowned, his sharp features pulling tight. He gestured for 2 tactical operatives to follow him and marched toward the chain-link fence. Tommy trailed a few paces behind, blending into the small crowd of exhausted locals who hadn't gone inside yet. Miller stopped at the fence. Inside, Tarek and his 4 soldiers sat on the overturned milk crates. Tarek was still wearing the oversized flyer's hoodie. His pale, greyish skin looked miserable in the harsh morning light, and he was currently staring at a half-eaten glazed donut with an expression of profound confusion. Miller stared. The tactical operatives lowered their rifles slightly, their laser sights tracing meaningless red dots on the muddy ground. "These are the extraterrestrial combatants?" Miller asked, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. "Yes, sir," Dougherty said. "I issued a citation for the property damage. They haven't been responsive since." Miller turned sharply, glaring at the stripped hulk of the spaceship taking up the lot. And the vessel's satellite imaging from 4 hours ago showed a fully armed, heavily shielded cruiser. This is a hollowed-out shell. "Where are the weapons arrays? Where is the propulsion system? Did they initiate a self-destruct?" Tommy shoved his hands deep into his pockets. He looked at Kev. Kev was staring intensely at a nearby fire hydrant, whistling softly through his teeth. "Don't know, Agent Miller," Tommy said, his voice level. "It crashed pretty hard, shook the whole block. We all stayed inside. By the time the sun came up, it looked like that. Maybe the impact knocked all those parts loose, or maybe it's some kind of, biodegradable metal. Miller whipped his head around, locking eyes with Tommy. The agent's gaze was cold, sharp, and highly trained to detect bullshit. Tommy forced himself not to blink, leaning into the bone-deep exhaustion radiating through his muscles. Biodegradable metal, Miller repeated flatly. He looked at the jagged, saw-cut edges of the ship's hull. He looked at the heavy tow truck tracks dug deep into the frozen mud. He looked at Brendan, who was currently trying to casually kick a discarded alien plasma conduit under a parked minivan. Miller took a deep breath. He exhaled a long plume of white vapor. He knew exactly what had happened. He also knew he didn't have the manpower to raid 30-row homes to find a missing alien warp drive. "Quarantine the block," Miller barked to his tactical team, rubbing his temples. "Nobody in, nobody out. I want hazmat down here to sweep for radiation, and I want a linguistics team to try and talk to whatever that is." He pointed at Tarek. "Hey!" Patty yelled from her stoop, clutching her bathrobe. "You can't quarantine us. I got 3 route touch-ups scheduled for noon." "Ma'am, this is a matter of national security," Miller snapped. "National security doesn't pay my gas bills, suit." Tommy backed away, retreating toward the shadow of his garage. He needed sleep. He needed 4 ibuprofen and a hot shower. But as he turned, a loud static screech tore through the morning air. It was coming from Patty's dog run. Tarek was holding a small rectangular device. It looked cobbled together from pieces of his shattered translation orb, wrapped tightly in silver duct tape. Leo was standing on the other side of the fence, looking immensely proud of himself. "I fixed it," Leo yelled, waving at Tommy. "Bypassed the main board, wired it straight into a 9-volt battery. It barely holds a charge, but it works." Tarek tapped the device. It crackled, emitting a harsh whine, before settling into a heavily distorted mechanical voice. "Listen to me, native scavengers." Tarek's voice echoed through the duct-taped box, sounding less like a conqueror and more like a tired radio DJ. "Your theft is irrelevant. My distress beacon triggered the moment we breached your atmosphere. The Vanguard is coming." Agent Miller froze. The tactical team raised their rifles again. "The Vanguard." Miller demanded, stepping toward the fence. "Explain. How large is this vessel?" Tarek ignored the federal agent. He looked directly at Tommy. The alien's large, solid black eyes held a grim, fatalistic certainty. "It is a planetary extraction ship," Tarek said through the static. "Commanded by Fleet Admiral Korath. He does not demand submission. He demands resources. When he arrives and sees that you have desecrated an Imperial dreadnought, he will not land. He will simply ignite your atmosphere." Tommy felt the cold finally reach his bones. The heavy envelope hidden in his wall suddenly felt like a death sentence. The mood on 4th Street shifted from victorious exhaustion to a grim, suffocating panic. Agent Miller was shouting into a satellite phone, pacing frantically near his SUV. "No, sir, not a rescue mission. A planetary extraction. Yes, I understand we don't have orbital defenses. Evacuate to where, sir?" "He said ignite the atmosphere." Tommy stood by the dog run, staring at Tarek. The alien was chewing on a soft pretzel Old Man O'Malley had bought from a street vendor 2 blocks over. Tarek took a bite, chewed slowly, and winced. The coarse salt clearly offended his palate, but the carbohydrates seemed to be keeping him upright. "When?" Tommy asked. Tarek swallowed hard, a visible shudder running down his spindly grey neck. "Given the coordinates and the standard slip space velocity of an extraction vessel, less than 1 of your planetary rotations. Perhaps by nightfall." "Can you call them off?" Kev asked, leaning heavily on the chain-link fence. The tow truck driver had lost his bravado. The prospect of the world ending meant nobody was going to need their cars towed. "I am a sub-commander who lost a 1 billion-credit dreadnought to a tribe of bipedal mechanics." Tarek said, the translator box rendering his tone dripping with bitter irony. If Admiral Korath finds me alive, he will have me executed for incompetence. If I call him, it only confirms my failure. So we're dead, Brendan said, kicking the chain link. Frank's halfway to Jersey with the engine, and we're all gonna burn. Tommy ran a hand over his face. His beard felt like sandpaper. He looked at the gutted ship. The feds were currently taping heavy plastic tarps over the missing hull sections, a useless gesture of containment. Not necessarily, Tommy muttered. Kev and Brendan looked at him. Even Tarek tilted his elongated head. He said Korath wants resources, right? Tommy said, pointing at Tarek. He expects to find a functional dreadnought guarding a subjugated populace. If he finds a stripped carcass, he burns us. Correct? Tarek crackled. So what if he doesn't find a stripped carcass? Tommy looked around the street. What if he finds a hostile environment? What if he thinks this planet isn't worth the cost of extraction? Tarek's black eyes narrowed. Earth is a Class 3 nitrogen-oxygen world. It is highly valuable. Yeah, but he doesn't know what kind of things live here. Tommy argued, his brain moving faster than his exhaustion should have allowed. Right now, your admiral thinks you got ambushed by a superior military force. If he sees humans with guns, he'll just shoot from orbit. But what if we convince him you didn't crash because of a war? What if you crashed because this planet is a hyper-corrosive death trap? Kev squinted. Tommy, what are you talking about? I'm talking about a scam, Kev, Tommy said, a grim smile finally breaking through his fatigue. The feds want to shoot at them. That'll get us killed. But these aliens, they don't know our biology. They don't know our ecosystem. Tarek, if Korath thought the very air of this city dissolved, Valen metal, would he land? Tarek stared at the half-eaten pretzel in his hand, then at the rusting, pothole-cratered street. He looked at the feral, opportunistic humans standing around him. The Empire does not invest resources in planets plagued by rapid metallurgical decay, Tarek admitted slowly. It is entirely unprofitable. Right. Unprofitable. Tommy clapped his hands together, the sound sharp as a pistol shot. We need to make South Philly look like the most unprofitable, toxic, ship-eating hellhole in the galaxy, and we need you to tell him that. Tarek stood up, dropping the pretzel. I would be committing treason. I would be exiled. You're already exiled, pal, Tommy said bluntly. You lost your ship to a guy with a sawzall and a kid who steals catalytic converters. The Empire doesn't want you back. But if you help us, Patty's got a spare room in her basement. It's warm, and we can probably find you food that doesn't taste like a cardboard. Tarek looked at the small brick row homes. He looked at the grey, miserable sky. Then he looked at Tommy. Your terms, Tarek said through the static, are acceptable. What is the strategy? Tommy spun around. He walked right up to Agent Miller, who had just hung up his satellite phone and looked like he was about to vomit. Agent Miller, Tommy said, I need your guys to stand down. Give us the perimeter back. Miller glared at him. Excuse me. The president is currently being moved to a bunker, and you want me to give you the perimeter. Your guns aren't going to stop an orbital laser, Tommy said softly, stepping into Miller's personal space. He smelled the agent's expensive cologne, entirely out of place here. You want to save the world. Let us do our jobs. We're going to sell them a lemon. At 4:42 p.m., the sky over Philadelphia turned the color of a bruised plum. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 5 minutes. The clouds didn't part. They were pushed aside by a massive geometric shadow. The Vanguard didn't look like Tarek's dreadnought. It was 3 times the size, a sleek, terrifying wedge of polished obsidian that blotted out the setting sun. It descended, slowly hovering 1,000 feet above the city, completely silent. It didn't need anti-gravity thrusters. It held itself aloft, through sheer brute force manipulation of physics. Every tactical operative on the street had their weapon raised. Agent Miller stood behind his SUV, his hand resting on his holstered sidearm, sweating profusely despite the freezing cold. Down in the street, the scene was meticulously crafted chaos. Tommy had spent the last 8 hours coordinating the neighborhood. The gutted dreadnought was currently rigged with industrial smoke machines Kev had borrowed from a nightclub down on Delaware Avenue. Thick, acrid yellow smoke poured from the jagged holes in the hull. They had taken every spare battery, every rusted car part, and every bucket of caustic chemicals from Tommy's garage and smeared it across the alien metal. They had Patty dump 20 gallons of expired, highly concentrated hair bleach onto the alien armor plating, causing the metal to aggressively foam and discolor into a sickly, corroded green. Tarek stood in the center of the street, completely alone. He was holding the duct-taped communicator. He had stripped off the flyer's hoodie and was wearing only his pale gray skin and a set of ragged, torn utility pants. He had rubbed engine grease under his eyes to look exhausted and diseased. A beam of violet light shot down from the Vanguard, illuminating the street. A voice boomed from the sky, so loud it rattled the glass in the row homes. It wasn't translated into English. It was a harsh, clicking, guttural roar of alien authority. Tarek pressed the button on his communicator. He spoke back in his native tongue. His voice shook not from acting, but from genuine terror. Inside Tommy's garage, hidden behind the cracked window, Tommy, Kev, and Agent Miller watched. "What is he saying?" Miller hissed his knuckles white as he gripped the windowsill. "He's telling them the truth, mostly." Tommy whispered, his eyes fixed on the sky. "He crashed. But he's lying about why. He's telling them the atmosphere here is seeded with a microscopic silicon-eating fungus, that it dissolved his stabilizers mid-flight." The booming voice from the ship replied, sounding angry, skeptical. Tarek gestured frantically toward his ruined ship. He pointed at the yellow smoke, the foaming green bleach reacting with the hull armor, the jagged stripped wires that looked like they had been eaten away by acid rather than cut by a teenager. Tarek coughed violently, a wet, hacking sound. He fell to his knees, clawing at his throat, pointing at the sky. "Tell them it's in your lungs," Tommy thought, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Sell it, Derek." A heavy silence fell over the neighborhood. The violet beam shifted, scanning the gutted dreadnought. The ship's sensors would detect the missing power core, the missing thrusters, but without context, it looked exactly like a ship that had been aggressively dissolved by a hostile environment. The Vanguard hovered. The fate of the planet hung on the interpretation of sensor data by an alien commander sitting in orbit. Suddenly the voice boomed again. This time it didn't sound angry. It sounded disgusted. The tone of someone who had just stepped in something vile and wanted to scrape it off their boot. The violet beam snapped off. The massive wedge of the Vanguard tilted its nose upward. There was no grand departure, no dramatic warp flash. It simply began to accelerate, climbing higher and higher, shrinking to a dark speck against the twilight sky before vanishing entirely. They didn't want the planet. They didn't even want their broken, contaminated ship. They just wanted to leave. For 10 seconds nobody moved. The only sound was the hiss of the smoke machines and the distant hum of traffic on I-95. Then Old Man O'Malley let out a piercing, ragged cheer. The street erupted. People poured out of their houses. Patty ran into the street and hugged Kev. Brendan tackled Leo into a snowbank. Agent Miller slumped against the side of the garage, sliding down the brick wall until he was sitting on the concrete, staring blankly at his polished shoes. Tommy pushed open the garage door and walked out into the street. The cold air felt incredible. He walked over to Tarek, who was still kneeling on the asphalt, staring at the empty sky. Tommy reached out a hand. Tarek looked at the greasy, calloused human hand. He reached up with a long, grey, spindly arm and let Tommy pull him to his feet. "They abandoned me," Tarek said softly, his translator box crackling. "Yeah, well, welcome to Philly," Tommy said, clapping the alien on the shoulder. "Grab a broom. We got to sweep up this glass before a tire gets punctured." By Monday, the government had hauled away the hollow shell of the dreadnought on a massive flatbed, strictly classified and deeply useless to their R&D department. Agent Miller never came back. The neighborhood returned to normal, or as normal as it could be. Tommy paid off his mortgage in cash on Tuesday. On Wednesday, he was back under the 04 Hyundai Elantra, trying to pry a rusted exhaust manifold loose. He reached out his hand blindly. "Hand me the half-inch socket," Tommy grunted. A long, grey 7-foot arm extended, placing the exact correct socket into Tommy's palm. The torque specifications on this primitive transport are inherently flawed, Tarek noted, crouching awkwardly beside the car, wearing a fresh set of dark blue mechanics coveralls with "Derek" stitched in red cursive over the breast pocket. "I know, Derek." Tommy sighed, ratcheting the bolt loose. "I know. Just hold the light steady. Did you enjoy this deeply grounded, gritty sci-fi comedy, where humanity doesn't win with lasers, but with angle grinders, street smarts, and a perfectly executed hustle? If you loved watching a terrifying alien warlord get reduced to an underpaid mechanic named Derek Smash, that like button share this story with anyone who knows the true, terrifying power of a local scrapyard. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more original HFY sci-fi stories that break the mold. Drop a comment below. What city would you want to see an alien invasion fail in next? See you in the next one.